Chapter 2: EU Democracy and the Audit Problem. One of the main elements of the Russia-Ukrainian conflict is the defense of democracy. One of the main selling points for the unconditional support for Ukraine and "we stand with Ukraine as long as necessary" statements is the claim that Ukraine is a democratic state, defending the pillars of Western democracy against the totalitarian Russia. However, if we look at the European Union and the state of democracy in the EU of late, it increasingly looks like the Union's economic health, poor to say the least. In late 2025, the state of free speech in the EU is characterized by a regulated speech model that increasingly contrasts with the American open marketplace model, creating friction between the US and EU. The EU maintains that free speech is a fundamental right, but a freedom that must be balanced against other rights like safety, privacy, and democratic integrity. This has led to a highly regulated environment that proponents call safe and critics call censorial. The regulatory landscape, the DSA and EMFA, two major pieces of legislation, now define the boundaries of expression in the EU. The Digital Services Act, fully operational in 2025, this law mandates that platforms like Meta, TikTok, and X must remove illegal content, example, hate speech, terrorist content, quickly once notified. It also forces platforms to mitigate systemic risks, which include the spread of disinformation that could harm elections or public health. The European Media Freedom Act, implemented in August 2025, this act aims to protect journalists from state surveillance and editorial interference. However, it also creates a framework for vetted media, which some argue gives the EU too much power to decide who is a legitimate journalist. The transatlantic censorship clash. A significant development in late 2025 is the escalating diplomatic row between the EU and the United States regarding these laws. U.S. sanctions. In December 2025, the U.S. State Department imposed visa restrictions on 5 European officials and activists, including leaders of groups like HateAid and the Global Disinformation Index. The U.S. accused them of engaging in anti-free speech activities that target American platforms and citizens. The EU's response. European leaders, including President Emmanuel Macron, have defended the EU's regulatory sovereignty, arguing that Europe's rules are a democratic choice to protect citizens from online harms like deepfakes and hate speech. The EU model faces several objective criticisms and internal pressures. Because the DSA imposes massive fines, up to 6% of global revenue, critics argue platforms will over-moderate, deleting perfectly legal but controversial speech to avoid the risk of a fine. Especially this massive fine clause has met fierce criticism from the USA, and Elon Musk, the owner of X, claimed that the EU was a bureaucratic monster. The regulators were woke Stasi commissars, and the DSA should be abolished after his company was fined a staggering 120 million euros for breaching the regulation. Terms like disinformation or harmful content are also notoriously difficult to define. Furthermore, in 2025, several EU countries faced protests, notably Lithuania and Slovakia, over government attempts to change how public media CEOs are appointed, raising fears of political capture under the guise of improving media standards, basically appointing the governing body of state-owned publication institutions politically, Soviet style. The argument for the Soviet comparison. Critics, often from the populist right and the DiEM25 left, point to specific structural issues to justify this comparison. The unelected executive argument. The European Commission, the body that proposes all EU laws, is, for example, not directly elected by citizens.